History records a gruesome scene: a corpse, exhumed from its grave, put on trial, and publicly hanged before a watching crowd. Its head was displayed on a long spike outside the Houses of Parliament for 25 years, a curse upon the most heinous of traitors. Yet this very same man in his life was the Lord Protector who held absolute power over England. He was the man who shocked all of Europe, the one who signed the death warrant of a king believed to be chosen by God himself. He was a farmer who did the unthinkable. He helped execute a king and then became the Lord Protector, ruling as a monarch in all but name, though he ultimately refused the crown. He promised to free the people from the chains of monarchy, only to bind them in chains far more severe. So, was this man a liberator or a tyrant, a saint or a sinner? Welcome to the story of Oliver Cromwell, the farmer who changed the course of English history forever. To understand the earthquake that was Oliver Cromwell, you must first understand the ground on which he stood, the intricate web of social, political, and spiritual tensions that defined the England of his birth. The nation he was born into in 1599 was a kingdom resting on a fault line. On the surface, it was the age of the Stuarts, a time of courtly masques, Shakespearean drama, and what appeared to be a settled Protestant church. King James I, who had succeeded the childless Elizabeth I in 1603, had united the crowns of England and Scotland, bringing with him a learned, if pedantic, belief in the absolute power of monarchs. But beneath this veneer of high culture and political union, deep tremors of discontent were growing. The central conflict was a battle of ideas, a clash between two irreconcilable views of the world, two competing visions for the soul of England. On one side stood the institution of the monarchy, embodied with tragic conviction by James's son, King Charles I. For Charles, who ascended the throne in 1625, kingship was not a job. It was a divine appointment, a sacred trust bestowed upon him directly by God. He believed with every fiber of his being in the divine right of kings. This was not mere arrogance. It was the bedrock of his worldview, the lens through which he saw every political act. God had placed him on the throne, and to God alone was he answerable. Parliament, in his view, was a tool to be used, a council to be consulted when it suited him, but never an equal partner in governance. Its primary, almost sole purpose was to grant him the money he needed to rule. When it refused, or when it dared to question his policies, his ministers, or his religion, he simply ruled without it. For 11 long years, from 1629 to 1640, Charles locked the doors of Parliament, initiating a period his opponents would come to call the personal rule or the 11 years tyranny. During this time, he raised funds through ancient, often obsolete taxes, like ship money, which was levied across the entire country, not just coastal towns, infuriating the gentry and merchants who saw it as an illegal tax imposed without their consent. For Charles and his supporters, this was the king simply taking what was rightfully his to ensure the kingdom's proper function. For his detractors, it was the act of a despot, a clear sign that he intended to dismantle the traditional rights of Englishmen and impose an absolute monarchy on the French model. On the other side of this growing divide was a rising tide of religious and political dissent, a movement embodied by a group known as the Puritans. The word Puritan often conjures images of joyless, black-clad fanatics, obsessed with sin and determined to stamp out all earthly pleasures. While this caricature contains a grain of truth, the reality was far more complex and intellectually robust. The Puritans were devout Protestants, the spiritual heirs of John Calvin, who believed that the Church of England, established by Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I, had not gone far enough in its break from Rome. They saw it as half-reformed, still cluttered with the ceremony, the bishops, the stained glass windows, and the ornate rituals of the Catholic Church it had replaced. They wanted to purify it, to strip it back to the simple, unadorned word of God as found in the Bible. They believed in sermons, not ceremonies, in Scripture, not sacraments, in a direct personal relationship with God, unmediated by a hierarchy of priests and bishops. This wasn't just a theological dispute about church decoration or the wording of prayers. It was profoundly political. At the heart of Puritan belief was the idea that no man, not a priest, not a bishop, and most certainly not a king, stood between an individual soul and their God. This belief fostered a fierce spirit of independence and a deep, ingrained suspicion of absolute authority in any form. If a king could appoint bishops, and those bishops could dictate how a person must worship, then the king was usurping the authority of God himself. This made them naturally resistant to the kind of absolute monarchy Charles I envisioned. And Charles, with his high church Anglicanism, his love of ceremony, and his French Catholic wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, seemed to them to be deliberately steering the country back towards Rome, back towards spiritual and political tyranny. Their worst fears seemed to be confirmed when the king's chosen Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, began a campaign to impose religious uniformity across the land. Laud enforced the use of the Book of Common Prayer, re-erected altar rails in churches, and viciously persecuted Puritan preachers who dared to defy him. To a Puritan, an altar rail was not a piece of wood. It was a barrier between the congregation and God, a symbol of priestly power, a step back to the Catholic Mass. Laud's reforms were not just an offense, they were a sign of the apocalypse, a betrayal of the Protestant nation. Into this simmering cauldron of faith, fear, and political ideology, Oliver Cromwell was born, a man whose soul was a perfect mirror of the nation's turmoil. His early life was, by all accounts, thoroughly ordinary, giving no hint of the volcano that lay dormant within. Born in Huntingdon in 1599 to Robert and Elizabeth Cromwell, he belonged to a family that had done well out of the Reformation. He was a distant relation of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister, whose family name he inherited, the man who had dissolved the monasteries, and the family's wealth was built on former church lands, but by Oliver's time that fortune had dwindled. He was a gentleman farmer, a man of the soil, more comfortable in the saddle inspecting his fields than in a London debating chamber. He attended the local grammar school and then spent a year at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, a recent foundation already known as a hotbed of Puritan thought. His university education was cut short by the death of his father in 1617, which forced him to return home to manage the family estate and care for his widowed mother and 7 unmarried sisters. He married Elizabeth Bourchier in 1620, the daughter of a wealthy London merchant. By all accounts, it was a loving and successful marriage that produced 9 children. Elizabeth would prove to be a loyal and steadfast partner, a point of stability and calm in the storm of her husband's life. For the first 40 years of his life, there was nothing to suggest the titanic figure he would become. He farmed his land, served as a justice of the peace, and in 1628 was elected as the Member of Parliament for his hometown of Huntingdon for the first time. He made only one recorded speech, a rambling and passionate defense of a local Puritan preacher, before Charles dissolved the body the following year, beginning his personal rule. Cromwell returned to his farm, his brief moment on the national stage seemingly over. In fact, the most significant event of his early adulthood was not political, but a profound personal crisis. In his late 20s and early 30s, Cromwell was struck by a severe depression, what his contemporaries called melancholia. He was plagued by a crippling sense of his own sinfulness, convinced that he was damned to eternal hellfire. His physician's records from the time note that Cromwell was valde melancholicus, very melancholy, and would often wake him in the middle of the night, certain he was on the verge of death. He was a man tormented, wrestling with the great existential questions of salvation and damnation in the privacy of his own soul. Then, sometime in the 1630s, something changed. Cromwell experienced what can only be described as a spiritual rebirth. He emerged from his dark night of the soul not with peace, but with a terrifying certainty. He became convinced that he was one of God's elect, that his sins had been forgiven, and that he had been saved by divine grace. He became a devout, zealous, and utterly committed Puritan. This conversion was the defining moment of his life. It was the anvil upon which his character was forged. It gave him an unshakable purpose, an ironclad certainty, and a formidable sense of divine mission. From this point forward, he believed himself to be an instrument of God's will. Every decision, every battle, every political maneuver was guided by a constant search for what he called providence. He did not act for himself, for personal gain or glory. He acted for God. This absolute faith was the source of his incredible strength, his ferocious energy, his iron self-discipline, and also his capacity for ruthless, cold-blooded brutality. He was fighting a holy war, and if you stood against him, you weren't just standing against a gentleman farmer from Huntingdon. You were standing in defiance of the will of the Almighty himself. In 1640, after 11 years of ruling alone, King Charles I was broke. A foolish and arrogant attempt to impose the Anglican prayer book on the fiercely Presbyterian Scots had resulted in a rebellion and 2 disastrous military campaigns, known as the Bishops' Wars. The Scots had invaded the north of England and were occupying Newcastle, demanding a huge daily payment until a treaty was settled. Charles had no money to pay them and no army to fight them. His treasury was empty. He had no choice but to do the one thing he had resisted for over a decade: recall Parliament. Cromwell, his local reputation enhanced by his passionate defense of commoners' rights in local land disputes, was elected as the Member of Parliament for the borough of Cambridge. He arrived in London in November 1640, a man of 41, a rough, unpolished country squire, who must have seemed utterly out of place amongst the sophisticated courtiers and lawyers of the capital. One contemporary, Sir Philip Warwick, described him as very ordinarily apparelled in a plain cloth suit, which seemed to have been made by an ill country tailor. His linen was plain and not very clean. He had a speck of blood on his collar. His hat was without a hatband. His voice was sharp and untunable, his manner fiery and passionate. He was nobody of importance, just another angry backbencher, one of hundreds of MPs with a long list of grievances against the king. No one in that chamber, observing this coarse, vehement man, could have possibly imagined that within a decade he would be the most powerful person in the land, having swept them all aside. The Parliament that assembled in 1640, which would come to be known as the Long Parliament, was a tinderbox. The grievances that had been suppressed for over a decade erupted in a torrent of political fury. Led by skilled parliamentarians like John Pym and John Hampden, the House of Commons set about dismantling the machinery of the king's personal rule. They impeached and imprisoned Archbishop Laud and the king's most formidable minister, the Earl of Strafford, eventually passing an act of attainder to have him executed, an act Charles signed with profound regret, later seeing it as the sin for which God was punishing him. They passed laws to ensure that Parliament must be called at least every 3 years and could not be dissolved without its own consent. They abolished the hated courts of the Star Chamber and High Commission and declared taxes like ship money illegal. For month after month, they chipped away at the foundations of royal authority. Charles fought back, but from a position of weakness. He saw every concession not as a necessary compromise, but as a sacrilegious assault on his God-given authority. The relationship between king and parliament broke down completely, poisoned by years of mutual distrust. The final, irrevocable split was precipitated by another crisis from across the sea. In October 1641, a catastrophic rebellion broke out in Ireland. The native Catholic Irish rose up against the Protestant English and Scottish settlers who had taken their lands. Wildly exaggerated reports of atrocities, of a general massacre of Protestants, flooded into London, creating an atmosphere of panic and anti-Catholic hysteria. An army was needed to crush the rebellion, but Parliament dared not entrust the king with command of it. They feared, with good reason, that Charles would use that army not against the Irish, but against them. This deadlock over military command led directly to the final rupture. In January 1642, convinced that his leading opponents were guilty of treason and were plotting with the Scots, Charles made a fatal miscalculation. Hearing that they intended to impeach his Catholic queen, he marched into the House of Commons with an armed guard of some 400 soldiers to personally arrest 5 of its leading members, including Pym and Hampden. It was an unprecedented breach of parliamentary privilege, a violation of a sacred space. But the men had been tipped off and had already fled, taking refuge in the city of London, which was now openly hostile to the king. As Charles left the chamber empty-handed, a cry of privilege, privilege, went up from the remaining members. The damage was done. The king had used force against his own parliament. The act was seen as proof of his tyrannical intentions. London erupted in fury, its trained bands taking to the streets to defend Parliament. Charles, humiliated and fearing for his family's safety, was forced to flee his own capital. He traveled north to York to raise his standard and his army. Parliament, in his absence, began to do the same. The time for words was over. Both sides began to raise armies. The English Civil War had begun. With the king's standard raised at Nottingham and Parliament's forces mustering in London, the deep, irreconcilable fractures in the kingdom had finally split the nation in two. The time for petitions, debates, and fiery speeches was over. The argument would now be settled with pike and musket on the fields of England. For the nation, it was the beginning of a tragic and brutal conflict that would leave no family untouched. For Oliver Cromwell, the passionate but obscure country squire, it was the beginning of his true life's work. The political and spiritual convictions that had smoldered within him for years would now be tested in the crucible of battle, and the unremarkable farmer was about to discover within himself an astonishing and terrifying gift for the very thing he had never been trained for: war. The great stage was set, and Cromwell, a minor player until now, was about to walk into the light. When the war began, the nation fractured along complex lines of geography, class, and creed. Those who supported the king became known as royalists, or cavaliers, a term that evoked an image of dashing, long-haired aristocrats. Their strength lay in the more sparsely populated agricultural and socially conservative regions of the north and west of England, and in Wales. Their cause was upheld by the majority of the nobility and the traditional gentry, men who saw the king as the linchpin of the social order and the head of the established Church of England. They fought for tradition, for hierarchy, and for the Book of Common Prayer. In command, the king had a natural advantage, his nobles raised from birth to lead men, and in his charismatic German nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, he possessed one of the most feared cavalry commanders in Europe. On the other side were the parliamentarians, derisively nicknamed Roundheads by their opponents, for the close-cropped haircuts favored by some of the London apprentices. Their power base was in the economically advanced and populous South and East, including the vital prize of London, with its financial wealth and vast arsenal. They controlled the navy, which allowed them to secure the ports and cut the king off from foreign aid. Their support came from a broad coalition of merchants, artisans, and a significant portion of the gentry, particularly those of a Puritan persuasion. They fought in their own minds for the ancient liberties of Englishmen, for the rights of Parliament, and for the freedom to worship God as their conscience dictated, free from bishops and popish ceremony. Their leadership was at first a significant weakness. It was dominated by high-ranking nobles like the Earls of Essex and Manchester, men who were politically and socially closer to the king they were fighting than to the radical religious firebrands in their own ranks. They sought not to destroy the king, but to contain him, to fight a negotiated war that would force him to the bargaining table and restore the old order with a few new limitations. They were reluctant warriors, a fact that would soon infuriate the man from Huntingdon. Cromwell did not hesitate. The moment the die was cast, he demonstrated a decisiveness that few on his side could match. He galloped back to his home county of Cambridgeshire and with remarkable speed raised a troop of 60 horsemen. He was not a passive politician waiting for orders. He was an active agent of the cause. In a bold move, he secured the entirety of Cambridge for Parliament and, crucially, intercepted a shipment of silver plate from the university's colleges that was destined for the king's war chest. It was a practical, decisive, and highly effective act that demonstrated his immediate grasp of the realities of war. It was won not just with courage, but with resources. While aristocratic commanders on both sides were mustering their tenants in grand, almost feudal fashion, Cromwell was already thinking like a quartermaster and a strategist. The early engagements of the war were messy, bloody, and largely indecisive, proving that both sides were ill-prepared for the conflict they had unleashed. At the Battle of Edge Hill in October 1642, the first major pitched battle, the pattern for the next 2 years, was set. Prince Rupert's royalist cavalry charged with breathtaking ferocity, smashing through the parliamentarian horsemen opposite them. But they lacked the crucial element of discipline. Intoxicated by their success, they galloped off the field in pursuit of the enemy's baggage train, leaving the royalist infantry to fight on alone. By the time Rupert's horsemen returned to the fray, the momentum was lost, and the battle ended in a bloody stalemate. Cromwell, who fought at Edgehill, watched and learned. He saw that piety and courage alone were not enough. A holy cause needed a professional, disciplined instrument to enact its will. Returning to East Anglia, he set about creating that instrument. He was given a commission as a colonel and began to expand his command, recruiting men not based on their social standing, but on their religious conviction and their skill. He sought out godly men, fellow Puritans, who believed, as he did, that they were fighting the Lord's battle against the forces of darkness. His philosophy was revolutionary, a direct assault on the aristocratic principle that had governed armies for centuries. He famously declared to a fellow commander, "I had rather have a plain, russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else." He drilled his men relentlessly, instilling in them a discipline that was both military and spiritual. His troops were paid regularly. a rarity that fostered loyalty and prevented the plunder that alienated the local populace. They were subject to a strict moral code. Drunkenness, swearing, and desertion were severely punished. But most importantly, he forged them into a community of faith. They sang psalms as they charged into battle, their swords in their hands and the word of God on their lips. They believed that providence was with them, that their commander was guided by God, and this conviction made them fanatically brave and resilient. Cromwell's true innovation, however, was tactical. He understood the power of cavalry, but he also understood, as Prince Rupert did not, that its power lay in control. He trained his horsemen to charge at a relatively slow trot, keeping them tightly packed knee to knee in a solid mass. They would discharge their pistols at close range to break the enemy formation and then drive home the attack with the sword. But the crucial difference, the stroke of genius, was what happened next. Unlike the Royalist cavalry, Cromwell's troopers did not pursue their fleeing enemies. At the sound of a trumpet call, they would rally, regroup, and reform their ranks, ready to charge again, or to wheel and crash into the exposed flank or rear of the enemy's infantry. It was this iron discipline, the ability to turn from a wild charge back into a controlled tactical weapon, that would revolutionize the battlefield. His regiment, which soon became known as the Ironsides, was becoming the most formidable fighting force in England. For 2 years, the war dragged on in a bloody seesaw of sieges and skirmishes. Then, in the summer of 1644, on a windswept moor in Yorkshire, Cromwell's star rose and the tide of the war turned. A combined army of parliamentarians and their new allies, the Scottish Covenanters, had besieged the vital northern city of York. Prince Rupert marched his army to relieve the city, and the two forces met at Marston Moor on July 2nd. It was the largest battle of the Civil War, with nearly 45,000 men engaged. Cromwell commanded the cavalry on the Allied left wing. As a thunderstorm broke over the field, he led his Ironsides forward at a trot, singing psalms. They crashed into the Royalist horsemen opposite them, led by Lord Byron. After a fierce and bloody struggle, the Royalists broke and fled. But as Cromwell prepared to rally his men, he was met by Prince Rupert himself, who had defeated the parliamentarian right wing and was now leading his elite reserve in a countercharge. The ensuing clash was the stuff of legend, a swirling melee of thousands of horsemen. Cromwell himself received a slight neck wound, but fought on. His disciplined troopers, better armed and more tightly controlled, eventually gained the upper hand. Rupert's legendary cavalry was smashed and driven from the field. It was a stunning victory, and Cromwell was not done. True to his training, he rallied his victorious Ironsides, reformed them, and led them across the moor to methodically destroy the now unprotected Royalist infantry, whose white-coated regiments fought with incredible bravery, but were now doomed. By nightfall, the king's northern army had ceased to exist. The victory was total, and it was Cromwell's. It was after this battle that Prince Rupert is said to have given Cromwell his enduring nickname, Ironside. A parliamentarian commander wrote back to London that Cromwell's troops were of God's making. Despite this stunning victory, the war did not end. The cautious and indecisive leadership of Parliament's aristocratic commanders, particularly the Earl of Manchester, frustrated Cromwell to no end. After the inconclusive Second Battle of Newbury, Cromwell openly clashed with his superior in Parliament, accusing Manchester of lacking the will to win. "If we beat the king 99 times, yet he is king still," Manchester had argued, "but if the king beat us once, we shall all be hanged." This revealed the deep political rift in the parliamentarian cause. The moderates feared total victory, not knowing what would come after. The radicals, like Cromwell, believed that victory was a divine imperative that must be pursued by any means necessary. This clash led to a radical restructuring of the parliamentarian war effort. In the winter of 1644 to 45, Parliament passed the Self-Denying Ordinance, a motion requiring all members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords to resign their military commands. It was a clever political stroke designed to sideline the ineffective noble commanders like Essex and Manchester without naming them directly. At the same time, they created the new model army, a single professional national fighting force of 22,000 men, organized along the lines of Cromwell's Ironsides based on merit, not birthright, and subject to centralized command under Sir Thomas Fairfax. Though Cromwell, as an MP, should have resigned his command, his military talent was now recognized as so indispensable that a special exception was made. He was appointed Lieutenant General of Horse, effectively Fairfax's second in command. The new model army's worth was proven in spectacular fashion at the Battle of Naseby in Northamptonshire on June 14, 1645. It was the decisive battle of the war. Once again, Prince Rupert's cavalry charged with wild success, shattering the parliamentarian left wing and galloping off to attack the baggage train. But on the other flank, Cromwell and his Ironsides obliterated the royalist horsemen facing them. And then came the classic Cromwellian maneuver. While Rupert was occupied far from the main fight, Cromwell rallied his men, turned them inwards, and plowed into the flank and rear of the brave, but now hopelessly exposed royalist infantry. The king's main army was annihilated. The victory was absolute, but its political consequences were even greater. The king's personal baggage was captured, and with it, his private correspondence. Parliament wasted no time in publishing these letters, which revealed to a shocked public that Charles was secretly seeking to bring Irish Catholic troops and foreign mercenaries into England to fight his own people. For many, this was the ultimate betrayal. Any lingering sympathy for him evaporated. He was no longer seen as a misguided monarch, but as a deceitful tyrant who would stop at nothing to regain his power. The First Civil War was effectively over. By 1646, the last royalist garrisons had surrendered, and the king himself was a captive. Parliament had won. But now a new, more dangerous question arose: what to do with a defeated king? The end of the war did not bring peace, it brought chaos. The victorious parliamentarian coalition, its common enemy defeated, immediately splintered. The majority in Parliament, known as the Presbyterians, were politically conservative. They wanted to disband the new model army without paying its enormous arrears of pay, restore Charles to a limited throne, and impose their own form of a national Presbyterian church on the country. The new model army, however, had become more than just a military force. It was a hotbed of radical religious and political ideas. Its ranks were filled with independents, Baptists, and other sects who had fought and bled for the right to worship as they pleased. They had not defeated the tyranny of bishops, only to submit to the tyranny of presbyters, and they were owed vast sums in back pay. They had no intention of quietly disappearing. Cromwell was the central figure in this power struggle, the only man who had a foot in both camps. He was a member of Parliament, but he was also the army's most revered leader. He tried to mediate, to find a compromise. But Charles I, ever convinced of his own divine right and his own cleverness, refused to negotiate in good faith. From his comfortable captivity, he played his enemies off against each other, believing that their divisions would ultimately force them to restore him on his own terms. In 1647, he escaped and made a secret deal with the Scots, promising to establish Presbyterianism in England in exchange for a Scottish army to restore him to the throne. The Second Civil War had begun. For Cromwell and the army, this was the ultimate act of treachery. They had offered the king generous terms, and he had repaid them with deceit and more bloodshed. They saw him now as a man of blood, a criminal tyrant who had plunged his kingdom back into war to save his own power. Before they marched off to fight, the army held a prayer meeting at Windsor, where they resolved that if they were victorious again, they would call Charles Stuart, that man of blood, to an account for that blood he had shed. The mood had hardened irrevocably. The time for negotiation was over. The time for divine justice had come. Cromwell moved with lightning speed, brutally crushing a royalist uprising in Wales before marching north to intercept the invading Scots. At the Battle of Preston in August 1648, in a masterful 3-day running battle, he utterly destroyed the larger Scottish army. The Second Civil War was over almost as soon as it began. Cromwell and his soldiers were now convinced that Providence had delivered a clear verdict. Twice they had defeated the king in battle. Twice God had shown his favor. The king's latest act of betrayal was a defiance of God's own judgment. While Cromwell was securing the north, the Presbyterian MPs in London, terrified of the army's radicalism, were still trying to sign a treaty with the king. For the army, this was an unforgivable betrayal of the cause for which so much blood had been shed. They decided to act. In December 1648, the army marched on London. Colonel Thomas Pride stood with his soldiers at the entrance to the House of Commons, and in an event that became known as Pride's Purge, barred or arrested over 100 of the Presbyterian MPs who still favored a treaty. This military coup left a small rump of about 60 members of Parliament who were sympathetic to the army. Their first act was to create a high court of justice to do the unthinkable, to put the King of England on trial for treason against his people. The trial of a king by his own subjects was an event of seismic, world-shattering proportions. It had never happened before. The very idea was an assault on the natural order of the universe, a defiance of God and tradition. When the trial began in January 1649 in Westminster Hall, Charles conducted himself with immense dignity and courage. He refused to enter a plea, simply denying the court's legitimacy. "I would know by what power I am called hither," he demanded, looking his accusers in the eye. "I would know by what authority I mean lawful authority." He argued that a king could not commit treason against his own people, for he was the law. But the court, driven by the iron will of men like Cromwell, pressed on. Cromwell, who had perhaps wavered on the finality of the act, was now its most resolute champion, convinced it was a cruel necessity that God required of them. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Charles Stuart was found guilty of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and a public enemy, and was sentenced to death. On a bitterly cold afternoon, January 30th, 1649, a scaffold was erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. A vast, silent, and stunned crowd gathered. King Charles I walked out, dignified to the last. He gave a short speech declaring his innocence and his faith. Fearing the executioner might be unnerved, he gave instructions to wait for his signal. He put his head on the block. After a moment, he stretched out his hands. With a single clean swing of the axe, the executioner severed his head from his body. An audible groan of horror went up from the crowd, a sound none who heard it would ever forget. The divine, sacred, and seemingly eternal chain of English monarchy, stretching back over 1,000 years, had been broken. And standing in the shadows, the man who had willed it all into being, the man whose journey had taken him from the muddy fields of the Fens to the bloody battlefields of the war and now to the seat of judgment, was the farmer from Huntingdon, Oliver Cromwell. He had not just defeated a king, he had destroyed the very idea of kingship itself, or so he thought. A new and terrible chapter was about to begin. The executioner's axe, with its single brutal swing, brought an end to the life of a king in the climactic struggle of the civil wars. But as the groan of the crowd rippled through the cold January air, the silence that followed was filled with a terrifying and uncertain question. What comes next? Tearing down a 1,000-year-old institution was one thing. Building a new one from the blood-soaked ground was another entirely. The act of regicide had created a republic, but it had also created a martyr, horrified every monarchy in Europe, and left a power vacuum at the heart of the nation. The victory was absolute, but the peace was fragile. Now Oliver Cromwell, the general who had proven so masterful at the art of destruction, would have to become a statesman, tasked with securing his fragile commonwealth against enemies at home and abroad. The war against the king was over. The war for the soul of the New England had just begun. The new commonwealth was an island of revolution in a sea of hostile monarchies. The execution of Charles I sent a shock wave of horror through the royal courts of Europe. England was a pariah state, its leaders branded as regicides and fanatics. But the most immediate and dangerous threats were closer to home. In Ireland, a powerful coalition of native Irish Catholics and English royalists, united in their opposition to the new Puritan regime, had declared the executed king's son, Charles II, as their rightful king. They controlled almost the entire island, presenting a perfect staging ground for a royalist invasion of England, potentially with the backing of Catholic powers like France or Spain. Simultaneously in Scotland, the Covenanter Parliament, though former allies of the English Parliament, were appalled by the killing of a Stuart king. They too proclaimed Charles II as king, not just of Scotland but of Great Britain. The fledgling English Republic was surrounded, its very survival in question. Internally, the situation was just as precarious. The Rump Parliament, that small remnant left after Pride's purge, had little claim to legitimacy and was widely seen as a puppet of the army. And the army itself, the very foundation of the new state, was seething with its own radical dissent. Groups like the Levelers, who had fought alongside Cromwell for Parliament's victory, now pushed for a truly democratic revolution. They demanded a new constitution, the Agreement of the People, which called for universal male suffrage, religious freedom for all, and the abolition of the House of Lords. They felt the army grandees, Cromwell included, had betrayed the revolution, replacing the tyranny of a king with the tyranny of a military junta. When their ideas sparked mutinies within the army in the spring of 1649, Cromwell's response was swift and ruthless. At Burford in Oxfordshire, he surprised the mutineers, crushed their resistance, and had their ringleaders executed by firing squad. It was a clear and brutal message. The time for radical agitation was over. Order and discipline were now the paramount virtues. The revolutionary was becoming a statesman, and he was willing to shed the blood of his former comrades to secure the state. With the home front suppressed, Cromwell turned his attention to the existential threat across the Irish Sea. In August 1649, he was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and commander of an expeditionary force of 12,000 veteran soldiers of the new model army. He landed in Dublin with a mindset forged in the furnace of religious war. To Cromwell and most of Protestant England, Ireland was a land of popish barbarism. They held a deep-seated fear and hatred of Catholicism, and this was amplified by the still raw memory of the 1641 Irish Rebellion, where lurid and wildly exaggerated tales of the massacre of Protestant settlers had been used as propaganda to fuel the war against the king. For Cromwell, this campaign was not merely a strategic necessity, it was a holy crusade, an act of divine vengeance. He was God's avenging angel, sent to punish a nation of heretics and murderers for the innocent blood they had shed. His campaign began with the siege of Drogheda, a royalist-held port town north of Dublin. The garrison, a mix of English royalists and Irish Catholics, refused his summons to surrender. On September 11th, the New Model Army's artillery breached the town walls, and the troops stormed the town. What followed would forever stain Cromwell's name. Enraged by the costly resistance, Cromwell gave the order to give no quarter to those in arms. In the brutal house-to-house fighting that followed, his soldiers killed not only the armed defenders, but also priests, friars, and civilians who had sought refuge in a church. In his official dispatch to Parliament, Cromwell described the scene without a flicker of remorse, his words a chilling insight into his providential worldview. I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood, and that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future. While the events at Drogheda and a few weeks later Wexford are undisputed facts, the scale of civilian casualties and Cromwell's direct responsibility remain subjects of intense historical debate. Nevertheless, these massacres became an indelible symbol of his brutality in Ireland. These atrocities, justified by Cromwell as necessary to break the will of the Irish resistance and shorten the war, had their intended effect. The back of the Royalist coalition was broken. While these massacres are the most infamous episodes of the campaign, the true devastation of the Cromwellian conquest was a slow, grinding horror. The war devolved into a brutal guerrilla conflict, which the English countered with a scorched earth policy, systematically destroying crops and livestock. This, combined with the arrival of the bubonic plague, led to a demographic catastrophe, While estimates vary and are still debated by historians, it is believed that a devastating portion of the Irish population perished from war, famine, and disease. This military conquest was followed by a revolutionary, social, and political settlement. Through a series of acts, vast swathes of land were confiscated from Irish Catholic landowners and redistributed to the English soldiers as payment for their service and to English financial speculators, the adventurers, who had bankrolled the war. The native Irish were dispossessed and under the infamous edict to hell or to Connaught. Thousands were forcibly transplanted to the barren lands west of the River Shannon. In Ireland, Oliver Cromwell is not remembered as a champion of liberty. He is remembered as a genocidal tyrant, a figure whose actions created a legacy of sectarian hatred and colonial dispossession that would endure for centuries. Having pacified Ireland with fire and sword, Cromwell was recalled to face the threat from Scotland. The Scots had crowned Charles II and raised an army to invade England. In the summer of 1650, Cromwell, now commander-in-chief of the entire New Model Army, marched north. He found himself in a perilous position, his army trapped near the coast at Dunbar, heavily outnumbered by a Scottish army under the command of the cautious and capable David Leslie. With his men ravaged by sickness and his back to the sea, Cromwell's situation seemed hopeless. The Scots held the high ground of Doon Hill and had only to wait for the English army to starve or attempt a desperate evacuation by sea. But on the night of September 2nd, Cromwell saw the Scots begin to move down from the hill, preparing, he surmised, to attack. He saw a tactical opening, a gift from God. Against the advice of his generals, he planned a daring pre-dawn assault. At first light on September 3rd, the English army charged, catching the Scots completely by surprise. The battle was a rout. The Scottish army was shattered, with 3,000 killed and 10,000 captured. For Cromwell, this stunning, improbable victory was one of the most powerful affirmations of his life. It was a sign of providence, a clear declaration that God was with him. A year later, Charles II and the remnants of the Scottish army made one last, desperate throw of the dice, bypassing Cromwell and marching south into England, hoping to spark a royalist uprising. The uprising never came. The English populace was too weary of war. Cromwell pursued them, cornered them at the city of Worcester, and on September 3, 1651, the exact anniversary of his victory at Dunbar, he attacked from all sides. The final royalist army was annihilated. "The dimensions of this mercy are above my thoughts," Cromwell wrote to Parliament. "It is, for aught I know, a crowning mercy." Charles II famously escaped the battlefield, spending 6 weeks as a fugitive with a bounty on his head, before finally finding passage to France. The civil wars were finally, truly over. Oliver Cromwell was the undisputed master of a united, or rather a conquered, Britain and Ireland. He returned to London a conquering hero, but the political problems he had left behind had only festered. He grew increasingly frustrated with the Rump Parliament. In his eyes, and the eyes of the army, it was corrupt, self-serving, and, most damningly, had failed to enact the godly reformation of the nation for which they had all fought. It squabbled over petty issues while neglecting the great work of building a new Jerusalem. In April 1653, his patience finally snapped. In one of the most dramatic scenes in English history, Cromwell marched into the House of Commons with a detachment of musketeers. He sat and listened to the debate for a while before rising to his feet and launching into a furious, blistering tirade. "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately," he roared at the stunned members. "Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." He gestured to the Speaker's mace, the sacred symbol of parliamentary authority, and sneered, "What shall we do with this bauble? Here, take it away." At his command, his soldiers cleared the chamber, and he ordered the doors locked. The man who had gone to war against a king for violating the sanctity of Parliament had now dissolved Parliament by brute military force. The revolution had come full circle. With Parliament gone, power now rested entirely with Cromwell and the army. After a brief failed experiment with a nominated assembly of Puritan saints, known as the bare-bones Parliament, the army leadership decided a more stable and formal structure of government was needed. In December 1653, a group of senior officers, led by General John Lambert, drew up a written constitution, the instrument of government. This document established a new state, the Protectorate, with power shared between a single executive, the Lord Protector, a Council of State, and a regular elected Parliament. Oliver Cromwell was named Lord Protector for life. In a grand ceremony in Westminster Hall, the same cavernous room where he had condemned a king to death, he was installed as the new head of state. He moved into the royal palaces of Whitehall and Hampton Court. He was addressed as Your Highness. The farmer from Huntingdon was now a monarch in all but name. Cromwell's 5-year rule as Lord Protector was a paradox, a mixture of progressive vision and authoritarian steel. His foreign policy was a stunning success. He built a powerful navy under the brilliant Admiral Robert Blake, which challenged the Dutch for maritime supremacy and defeated the Spanish, making England a respected and feared power in Europe once again. At home, he pursued a policy of limited religious toleration that was far ahead of its time. While Catholicism and Anglicanism were still suppressed, a wide array of Protestant sects were allowed to worship freely. In a landmark decision, he formally readmitted Jews to England for the first time in over 350 years. Yet his regime was fundamentally a military dictatorship, and it became increasingly authoritarian and unpopular. His attempts to bring about a godly reformation of morals were met with widespread resentment. When his first protectorate parliament challenged the basis of his authority, he dissolved it in a fit of pique. A royalist uprising in 1655 prompted him to impose direct military rule, dividing England and Wales into districts, each governed by a major general. These military governors were tasked with maintaining security and enforcing Puritan morality, suppressing alehouses, banning bear baiting and cockfighting, and discouraging Christmas celebrations. This was deeply unpopular, seen by most of the population as an oppressive tyranny. The central contradiction of his rule was laid bare in 1657. A new parliament seeking stability and a return to a more traditional form of government offered him the crown. The humble petition and advice begged him to become King Oliver I. It was the ultimate temptation. Accepting the crown would have made his rule legitimate in the eyes of many, traditional, and, crucially, hereditary. It would have secured the succession and ended the army's dangerous dominance in politics. Cromwell agonized over the decision for weeks, fasting and praying for a sign from God. But his old comrades in the army, the Republican grandees who had fought and bled to abolish the monarchy, were vehemently opposed. They saw it as the ultimate betrayal of the good old cause. In the end, Cromwell listened to them. He refused the crown. "I would not seek to set up that which Providence hath destroyed and laid in the dust," he declared. He would remain Lord Protector. But the episode revealed the trap he had built for himself. He was a revolutionary who craved order, a king-killer who yearned for the legitimacy of a king, a man who held absolute power but could never truly be a sovereign. His final year was one of weariness and sorrow. He was the most powerful man in the land, yet he was isolated, trapped by the contradictions of his own creation. His personal life was also marked by tragedy. He was a devoted family man, and the death of his favorite daughter, Elizabeth, from cancer in August 1658 left him utterly broken. He sat by her bedside for weeks, and her death seemed to shatter his own formidable will to live. He fell ill shortly after with a recurring bout of malarial fever compounded by a urinary infection. His body, exhausted by years of war and the immense burdens of governance, finally gave way. On September 3rd, 1658, the auspicious anniversary of his great victories at Dunbar and Worcester, Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland, died. He was given a state funeral of magnificent, almost royal proportions. His body was embalmed, and he was buried with solemn ceremony in a vault in Westminster Abbey, in the same chapel as the kings of England he had overthrown. It seemed that the farmer from Huntingdon had finally taken his place among the monarchs, but the republic he had forged was entirely dependent on the force of his personality. With his iron will now gone, the great question lingered: could his revolution possibly survive him? And so, with a funeral of royal splendor, the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell was laid to rest among the very kings he had overthrown. His journey from the misty fens to the throne of a kingdom seemed complete, his revolutionary settlement apparently secure and sanctified. To all appearances, he had succeeded not only in breaking the old world, but in forging a new one in his own image, its future seemingly guaranteed in the succession of his son Richard. Yet, the entire edifice of the Protectorate, its power, its legitimacy, and its purpose, had been built upon the singular, formidable foundation of one man's iron will. With that foundation now gone, the great structure would be tested. The final judgment on Cromwell and his good old cause would not be found in the solemn eulogies of his funeral, but in the chaos that would follow his death, proving that a revolution built by one man can rarely survive him. The succession fell to Cromwell's eldest surviving son, Richard. Where his father had been a tempest, Richard was a gentle breeze. He was a quiet, unassuming country gentleman who had taken no significant part in the civil wars or the political intrigues of the past decade. He was not a soldier, and he lacked the deep providential Puritan faith that had been the engine of his father's life. To his detractors, he was tumble-down Dick, a pale imitation of a great man. To his supporters in Parliament, however, his civilian nature was his greatest asset. They saw in him an opportunity to steer the Protectorate away from the dominance of the army and towards a more traditional gentry-led form of government. This immediately set him on a collision course with the Army's senior officers, the grandees, men like the ambitious John Lambert and Cromwell's own son-in-law, Charles Fleetwood. They had fought and bled for the cause, and they deeply resented this shift in power toward the civilians. They saw Richard as weak and viewed his attempts to curb their political influence with contempt. The Protectorate, deprived of Oliver's authority, quickly unraveled. The uneasy coalition of Puritan soldiers, Republican lawyers, and country gentry that he had held together through sheer force of will now splintered into its constituent parts. The grandees in the Army Council plotted to reassert their control, while the more junior officers and radical Republicans dreamed of dismantling the Protectorate altogether and returning to the purer form of a commonwealth. Richard, caught between these warring factions, had neither the political skill nor the ruthless instinct to survive. When a dispute between his Parliament and the Army Council came to a head in the spring of 1659, the army acted. They forced Richard to dissolve Parliament and, having stripped him of his only power base, left him isolated. With no desire for a confrontation he could not win, Richard Cromwell quietly resigned his office in May 1659, less than 9 months after succeeding his father. The Protectorate collapsed not with a bang, but with a whimper. What followed was a slide into anarchy. With no single figure of authority, the nation was subjected to a dizzying carousel of failed governments. The army recalled the old rump parliament, then dissolved it again when it proved too independent. They attempted to rule through a committee of safety, but their authority extended no further than their soldiers could enforce it. The good old cause, for which so many had died, was now a byword for incompetence and military oppression. The nation, exhausted by 2 decades of war, religious austerity, and political instability, began to yearn for a return to the old ways. The memory of King Charles the Martyr began to eclipse the memory of King Charles the Tyrant. A powerful tide of public opinion began to flow almost irresistibly towards the restoration of the monarchy, which now seemed to represent the only hope for peace, stability, and a return to legality. The key to unlocking this political paralysis lay in Scotland, with the man who commanded the most disciplined and professional army in the 3 kingdoms, General George Monk. Monk was the consummate professional soldier, pragmatic, cautious, and politically enigmatic. A former royalist who had been captured and then served Parliament and Cromwell with unswerving loyalty, his ultimate allegiances were a mystery to all. Watching the chaos unfold in London, he decided to act. In the cold of New Year's Day, 1660, he marched his army south from Scotland. He was the Sphinx of the hour. No one knew his intentions, and this uncertainty made him the master of the situation. He entered London without opposition and with cool deliberation set about restoring order. He brokered a deal to restore the Presbyterian members who had been purged by Colonel Pride back in 1648. This restored Long Parliament then, at Monk's direction, voted for its own dissolution and issued writs for the election of a new free parliament, the Convention Parliament. The elections were a landslide for the Royalists. The new Parliament assembled in April 1660, and its first act was to read a declaration from the exiled Charles II, a clever document brokered by Monk that promised a general pardon, liberty of conscience, and payment of the army's arrears. With jubilant cries, Parliament voted that by ancient and fundamental law, the government of England was and ought to be by king, lords, and commons. They formally invited Charles II to return from his long exile and take his father's throne. The revolution was over. On his 30th birthday, May 29, 1660, Charles II entered London to scenes of ecstatic celebration. The Puritan experiment was finished. The monarchy was restored. The restoration brought with it a wave of royalist revenge. While Charles had promised a pardon in his declaration, it included a crucial exception: the regicides, the men who had signed his father's death warrant. Some fled the country, but many were captured, put on trial, and condemned. They faced the full medieval horror of a traitor's death. They were hanged, cut down while still alive, disemboweled, and then cut into 4 quarters. But the chief regicide, the architect of the whole affair, was beyond the reach of earthly justice. Oliver Cromwell was already dead. This did not matter. For the new regime, a symbolic act of vengeance was required, a ritual to cleanse the nation of its past sins and to serve as a terrifying warning for the future. In an act of macabre, state-sponsored desecration, Parliament declared Cromwell a traitor and ordered that his body be exhumed from its tomb in Westminster Abbey. On January 30th, 1661, the 12th anniversary of the execution of King Charles I, the grisly spectacle took place. Cromwell's corpse, along with those of his son-in-law Henry Ireton and the Judge John Bradshaw, who had presided over the king's trial, was dragged on a sledge through the jeering London crowds to the public gallows at Tyburn, the place for common criminals. There, the dead bodies were hanged in chains for the entire day, a grotesque display for all to see. In the evening, the corpses were cut down and beheaded. His headless torso was thrown into a common pit beneath the gallows. His head, impaled on a 20-foot spike, was taken to be displayed above Westminster Hall, the very building where he had judged a king and had himself been installed as Lord Protector. It remained there for nearly 25 years, a weather-beaten, mummified warning to any who would dare to repeat his deeds. The man who had briefly been interred among kings was now treated as the basest of criminals. So what are we to make of this man, Oliver Cromwell? He remains one of the most divisive, complex, and argued-over figures in all of history. He is a paradox, a man of profound and irreconcilable contradictions. To some, he is the father of English democracy, a proto-liberal hero who fought for the principle that a ruler is accountable to the people and the law. They point to his belief in a republic, his championing of religious liberty, albeit a limited one, his promotion of men by merit rather than birth, and his establishment of parliamentary sovereignty, even if he later trampled on it himself. They see him as a military genius who modernized the army and whose foreign policy made England a great and feared power on the world stage. To others, particularly in Ireland, the verdict is far simpler. He is a war criminal, a religious fanatic, and a genocidal tyrant whose name is a byword for massacre and oppression. They see a man whose Puritan zealotry provided a divine justification for ethnic cleansing and colonial dispossession, leaving a scar on a nation that has never fully healed. For royalists and conservatives, he remains the ultimate villain of English history, a hypocritical and ambitious traitor who murdered his sacred king, destroyed the ancient constitution of the kingdom, and imposed a joyless military dictatorship on a resentful populace. Perhaps the only truth is that he was all of these things. He was a man of his violent, passionate, and deeply religious age, not of ours. He was driven by a genuine, and to the modern mind, terrifying conviction that he was doing God's work on earth. He was God's Englishman. This faith gave him his immense strength, but it also made him utterly ruthless. He fought for liberty of conscience, but could not tolerate the blasphemy of Catholics or the idolatry of Anglicans. He overthrew a tyrant in the name of Parliament, only to dissolve Parliament himself when it stood in his way. He was a man who rode a revolutionary tiger, and to survive, he had to become more powerful and more absolute than the king he had destroyed. He did not set out to become a dictator. He set out in his own mind to build a new Jerusalem, a godly commonwealth of saints. But the chaos he had helped to unleash could only be contained by the very authoritarian power he had originally fought against. The ultimate irony of Cromwell's life is that his brutal authoritarian rule so terrified England that it made a return to monarchy not only inevitable, but for most people, desirable. The glorious revolution of 1688, which finally and peacefully established the stable constitutional monarchy that Britain enjoys today, was a direct reaction against the memory of two things: the tyranny of a Catholic Stuart king on one hand, and the tyranny of Cromwell's Puritan major generals on the other. In a way, modern parliamentary democracy was built not just on Cromwell's principles, but on a deep and abiding fear of his methods. He remains a ghost in the English machine, a figure of both awe and terror. The farmer who became a kingslayer, who ruled as a king, and who was punished after death like a common traitor, forces us to confront a difficult and timeless question: how far is it acceptable to go in the pursuit of a righteous cause? And at what point does the liberator, in his noble quest to vanquish monsters, become a monster himself?